Sanctions is definitely on an upward trajectory. We've seen more sanctions being used than ever before. In my personal opinion, there was always going to be more sanctions than had been previously used whilst the UK was in the EU, because they adopted the new legislation that gave them more powers. But the Russia invasion of Ukraine saw that dramatically increase very, very quickly. And I think that's the direction of travel that's just going to continue to go forward from here.
I think sanctions is probably an area that isn't particularly well understood, both within the law enforcement sphere and also with our intelligence partners. So it's really a bit of an education piece.
Sanctions have grown exponentially, I think, over the last, 5 years, 6, 7 years or so. They're designed very much to bring about a change in undesired behaviour. They were brought about really through the United Nations framework following the end of the Second World War, and in more recent years, the use of sanctions has grown from just international organisations such as the United Nations to being used by individual countries, and that's very much how we've seen them, haven't we, being used since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And that has meant more and more countries have developed their own powers to use sanctions, not just against Russia, but against other thematics. So things like human rights abuses and corruption have very much been a thematic that sanctions over the last 5, 6 years or so have been designed to tackle. But also, terrorism has long been on the agenda of the use of sanctions to try and bring about, a disruption and change in that particular behaviour. But also in more recent years, things like cybercrime, ransomware, cryptocurrencies. We've seen that dynamic in the crosshairs of sanctions use. We can see, of course, the abuse of financial entities as well as a way to move funds via, complicit, maybe front companies that are involved in facilitating this kind of sanctions avoidance. We can also see things like diplomatic channels being utilised, where you may have like North Korean entities that are abusing and using maybe complicit diplomatic channels via third parties. So there are a multitude of mechanisms that can be used. On the North Korean side, finally, I would say we've seen them having to be quite robust at designing and delivering ways that they can avoid sanctions, because the sanctions against them are so heavy. So things like perhaps getting their nationals employed overseas and having their wages sent back for use by the regime. We've also seen a crossover between sanctioned countries and maybe state sponsorship of criminality involving cybercrime and ransomware that I mentioned, where whole teams of people are stealing cryptocurrencies, carrying out ransomware attacks, and they're using mechanisms to cash out of those proceeds. So yeah, it's a vast problem, it's a global problem, and it's going to require a team effort really to succeed. That private-public sector partnership is really crucial.
I think it's difficult sometimes in respect of sanctions because it involves policy decision-making, so it's used as a sort of foreign policy tool. So often there isn't particular trends that can be identified other than as soon as that policy decision is made, we see an influx of intelligence, information. Everybody's talking about the yachts and the private jets and things like that. So there is an initial willingness, particularly within the media as well, to provide information and commentary on what they think should be being done. That has a tendency to tail off depending on how long the sanctions are in place and whether other foreign policy decisions are being made.
Well, first of all, sanctions to the CBC is relatively new. We ensure that officers understand the origins of a sanction and understand what the intents are by the entities that impose those sanctions. We ensure that if it involves the movement of passengers or the movement of people in general, that those persons are updated in our system to ensure that their travel is not permitted, and to ensure that if they do travel here, we stop them at the border. Same thing with goods. If goods that are part of the sanction regime, we want to know what the international movement of those goods are. We want to be able to track the origin of these goods and ensure that they're stopped as well and not allowed to continue once it's imported. The challenge comes from making sure that we get it right. The challenge comes from making sure that we understand who don't need to be here or who should not be here is not allowed to come in. That has always been a challenge. We focus on the risk and we mitigate that by an intelligence approach. The challenge is to ensure that all of those things come together to help bolster a good decision.
There's a particular dynamic at play in the world of sanctions at the moment, and it really stems from difficulties at the United Nations, and this is really because of the way that the United Nations is made up, and you have a permanent Security Council that votes on new measures and furthering existing measures. And there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council. They are the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Russia and China. And the dynamic means that any one of those permanent members can exercise what's known as a veto. And therefore, even if the rest of the Security Council vote in favour of a new measure, one veto from the P5 means that it won't go ahead. In the current climate, maybe it's no surprise that Russia is the country that's exercised their veto more than any other. And that's why you have seen a rise in individual countries having to develop their own legislation to have sanctions that can be effective outside of the UN framework. So with that comes added complexity, because you have to have immense coordination to ensure that all of your designations align ideally, and timing, of course, becomes more of an issue. So with the way that we seem to be living in a multi sort of polar world now, where it's much more fragmented in terms of that harmony within the international community, I think it means that increasingly we're having to see more and more countries using sanctions outside of the UN to tackle these problems, and therefore that complexity issue is not going to get away. It is going to, it's going to increase, and therefore we really need to invest, in governments and in private sector partnerships to communicate ever-increasing complex, sanctions environments.
I'm very confident that the result of this will be that Cayman is able to demonstrate future commitment and action in implementing the sanctions regime, and ensuring that we are in a really strong position to meet future requirements of the FATF Action Task Force. I hope that together we can make sure that the world is a more safe, fair and free place for us all to live.